All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the blueprint from modern power. We're not going to focus on just one single person. Instead, we're looking at the patterns, the playbook, really, that connects how these massive fortunes are built and the incredible power that comes along for the ride.
And this quote from Warren Buffett? It absolutely sets the tone. What you see over and over again in the source material is this almost superhuman level of drive. It's an intensity that, frankly, most of us can't even imagine. And it's the price of admission to the world we're about to explore.
So, our journey today is going to follow a kind of three-act structure. First up, building the empire. Then, we'll see how that raw wealth gets turned into real systemic power. And finally, we'll get to the consequences, the final reckoning.
Okay, Act 1, building the empire. How in the world do you go from just an idea to a global powerhouse? Well, it turns out there are some pretty common ingredients, even if the chefs have totally different styles.
So you kind of see two main ways to the top here. On one hand, you've got the scrappy founder. Picture Sam Walton, obsessing over every single penny. And on the other side, something the author Kai-Fu Lee calls the Coliseum Gladiator. And for these guys, competition isn't just business, it's all-out war. We're talking copying products, smearing your rivals, and, like Robert Maxwell did, keeping everything in separate boxes so only you have the keys to the kingdom. It is absolutely a brutal win-at-all-costs mindset.
And these are really the pillars that hold that whole ascent up. You've got to outwork everybody. That was Robert Iger's whole deal early on. You need this crazy obsessive focus on the customer, which Jeff Bezos famously symbolized with that empty chair in meetings. You have to be the one to jump on new technology, the way Jennifer Doudna did with CRISPR. And yeah, you need that hands-on hustle. You got to be willing to do the stuff nobody else will, like Sam Walton literally driving a trailer full of discount panties himself.
So let's move on to Act 2. Because once the fortune is built, the entire game changes. It's not just about making more money anymore. It becomes about protecting that fortune, making it even bigger, and, crucially, using it to rewrite the rules of the game itself.
This quote from Charles Koch back in 1978, it's so revealing. The goal here wasn't just to tweak a policy or get a tax break. The ambition, as the book Dark Money lays out, was to use that enormous wealth to fundamentally rewire the entire system, to take a fringe ideology and drag it into the absolute center of political life.
So how do you do that? Well, one of the most powerful tools is something called a social welfare group. And you really need to understand this definition. It's a kind of nonprofit that can pour money into politics, and I mean a lot of money. But here's the kicker. It doesn't have to tell anyone where that money came from. This is the engine of what we call dark money.
And just look at the result. This chart is pretty stunning. It shows you just how big of a weapon this became. So, in 2006, you've got these secret donor groups making up, 2% of outside political spending. Tiny. But then just 4 years later, that number explodes to 40%. 40! That's not just an increase. That's a complete reshaping of how money, and let's be real, power, flows through the political system.
But straight-up political spending is only half the story. The other side of the coin is all about perception, right? It's about using philanthropy, not just to do good, but to build an image so perfect, so unassailable, that it becomes like a shield. It's how you legitimize yourself and your fortune, and it gets you a seat at the most elite tables in society.
And this playbook is just remarkably consistent across the board. The Sackler family, we're going to talk more about them in a second, they plastered their name on wings at the Met, at Harvard, at Columbia. The book Empire of Pain calls it aspirational giving, and it did a great job of hiding where the money was really coming from. You see others, like India's Dhirubhai Ambani, who just systematically worked the press. And for guys like Robert Maxwell, owning newspapers wasn't a business, it was a direct pipeline to power.
And that brings us to our final act, the reckoning. What happens when that relentless drive for profit and power just goes completely unchecked? What's the real price? Not just for the tycoons themselves, but for the rest of us.
Let's start with the Sackler family. Their company, Purdue Pharma, created and then super aggressively marketed the painkiller OxyContin. Their success built an incredible family dynasty, but it was built on a product that directly poured gasoline on a devastating public health fire.
This timeline is just chilling. As early as 1997, their own people in the field are sending back reports about the drug being abused. Yet in 2000, Richard Sackler swears under oath he only just found out about it. Fast forward to 2012, and the very doctors Purdue paid to promote the drug are now admitting the things they said weren't true. And then, in 2019, internal documents blow the whole thing open, proving the family wasn't just some passive owner, they were micromanaging every single detail.
Okay, let's switch gears from a public health crisis to a massive financial one. The story of Sam Bankman-Fried and the implosion of FTX, it's like a modern-day fable about what happens when insane ambition and a total disregard for the rules all collide.
The whole disaster boils down to this, right here. FTX was the public exchange where you put your money. Alameda Research was the private trading firm that was supposed to be separate, but in reality, they were the same thing. As Going Infinite details, customer money from FTX was being used by Alameda to make huge, risky bets. And the collateral for those bets? A crypto token that FTX itself just made up. So when that token collapsed, the whole house of cards came tumbling down.
But the consequences aren't always about money. Sometimes the reckoning is about deep, personal trauma. This quote, from a sworn statement by one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, just brings the human cost into painfully sharp focus. It's a stark reminder that behind all the headlines about wealth and power, there can be real, devastating harm to actual people.
And beyond these huge, specific disasters, there's a much broader societal reckoning going on. A lot of the very systems that allow these incredible fortunes to be built also have a direct and often negative impact on economic inequality for everyone else.
I mean, just look at the numbers. The book Asian Godfathers points to this 5-year period in Singapore where the economy was booming, but the actual incomes for the poorest 40%, they went down. And at the exact same time, the top tax rate was getting slashed. Looking ahead, thinkers like Kai-Fu Lee are warning that technologies like AI could throw this trend into overdrive, making that gap even wider.
So there it is. The playbook is just incredibly clear and consistent. It kicks off with a relentless, all-consuming climb to the top. Then, that wealth gets turned into real-world power and influence. And at the end of the day, there is always a reckoning, a confrontation with the consequences of that power, whether it's for an individual, a market, or for society as a whole.
And all of this leaves us with one final, massive question. In a world where one person's wealth and influence can be bigger than that of entire countries, who holds them accountable? Who makes sure that power is being used responsibly? That's the question this playbook forces all of us to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.